As a 501c3, the Aspen Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse, support, or oppose political candidates or parties. To the extent elected officials are present today, they are attending solely in their official capacity and not as political candidates. Further, the views of our guests and speakers do not necessarily reflect those of the Institute. Please remember to turn your mobile devices to silent. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please welcome Elliot Gerson.
Good morning, everyone. I realize many of you were out dancing to the wee hours or just coming back from your beach volleyball game this morning. But we are delighted to see you all today at our last day of this extraordinary conference. Today, we're going to be hearing from a wide range of experts in areas such as ocean biodiversity, gene editing, education, environmental justice, meteorology, and more. And I think that very range and breadth and depth are representative of what we think is different, unique, special, and compelling of this convening in the climate world. And it's something very suited to the kinds of things we like to do at Aspen, bringing people together from all kinds of perspectives and platforms and interests to come up with solutions to the urgent problems that we face. I'd like just briefly, again, to thank Greg and his remarkable team for pulling all of this together, and just take maybe a couple of seconds to reflect on the short but wonderful history of this event. It was just about 4 years ago, I think, when I had a phone call with the former mayor of Miami Beach, who had the vision to bring the Aspen Institute to Miami Beach to do something compelling and of great public significance. And the idea was to focus just on climate, unlike some of the other large public events we do that have a wide range of topics, because of just the extraordinary complexity of the challenges we have and all the areas that are important to explore. And it's exciting to see how that vision has matured over the last 3 years and to see all of you here today. Again, sincere thanks for being here, and I know you're going to greatly enjoy the plenary today and then the other events of the day. Thank you so much.
And now, Sarah Kapnick and Monica Medina.
Good morning.
So excited to be here.
Me too, me too. I want to start by saying thanks to Dan Porterfield and Greg Gershuni and the whole Aspen team for a tremendous conference. It's been great so far. I'm looking forward to this last day. So thanks, guys. So we're going to talk about oceans and hopefully give you some hope about the future of oceans given climate change and all the stress that we know it puts on the ocean. So Sarah, as NOAA's chief scientist, I know you think about the ocean all the time, both its impact on climate and the weather, but also on fisheries and all of the ocean economy that's built up around the ocean. So one of the things here in South Florida and all around the world that we know is taking a beating because of climate change is coral reefs. We saw last year ocean temperatures soar, particularly here in South Florida, 100 degrees or more in the water, unprecedented, and we know how hard that is on corals. But we also know there are some corals that are more heat resistant. We know there are efforts to restore coral reefs, and we know there's an awful lot of science going into this because they're so important to the ocean, both the economy around the ocean and tourism, but also for fisheries and food. So tell us how we can feel hopeful about the future given the stress that coral reefs and the ocean in general is under from climate change.
Yeah, so first the facts. According to NOAA's Physical Science Laboratory, over 40% of the ocean was in a marine heat wave this past year. A marine heat wave is defined as above 10% of the average in the distribution, and so we had never hit that large amount worldwide. It was caused by a combination of climate change, but also the El Nino that developed. So we saw this around the world, and usually during El Ninos, we see coral bleaching events. And in the Florida Keys, we saw major amounts of coral bleaching. And these are all pictures that we have from all the different sites that NOAA takes across corals around the world. So we saw these bleaching events, and when we just did our survey of Florida, we found in many locations that only 20% of stag corals were alive. The bleaching event really has taken its toll. And that's the depressing part. But on the positive side, we can manage what is happening. The incredible science that's happening here in South Florida and at NOAA is around understanding the corals, understanding why that happens, but also increasingly, we know how to grow corals. We actually, not far from here on Key Biscayne, we have a facility where we grow corals, where we're able to separate them, we're able to understand which ones are strong, which ones are hardy, what makes them grow well, what doesn't. And with that, we have the knowledge about how do we conserve those coral species, and then also when we need to and we go out and we restore coral reefs, how do you do so in a way that is then also hardy for the decades to come? And climate change is going to continue. We're on this march until we reach net zero emissions. But we know what the future holds in terms of temperatures in the atmosphere and temperatures in the ocean. And so we can plan for that as we do the restorations of these coral reefs in Florida and around the world to make them hardier for the future.
Well, and I'm so impressed with the people who are working on this every day, who are restoring corals. There's a great company called Coral Vita. I know Sam's been here talking. He'll be on the main stage, I think, later. And then you go places like in the Red Sea, and you see corals that are still thriving even in those high heat conditions. So
yeah, the Red Sea corals are really special corals that they're like the hardy, warm corals of the world. I wanted to ask you, the coral reefs are such an important habitat for fish and marine species. Can we zoom out and talk about how fish stocks are being affected around the world from environment and human stress causes? And also, how is this impacting food security, and what can the international community do to action? She used to lead our negotiations and work on biodiversity around the world for State Department and saw firsthand in the last few years how this plays out.
It is an incredibly important problem for us to really face head on. As we think about climate and how it's stressing the oceans, fisheries are moving all over the place in order to adjust and adapt to the heat conditions that we've just talked about. And so this is where my background as a lawyer comes in. Governance matters. We have to have good governance and flexible governance that can adapt with the conditions. So it's wonderful that in the US, at NOAA, the very agency that predicts climate, that understands the climate, the forces in the ocean that are causing these changes to happen, is also the one that regulates commercial fishing. So it's a perfect place for us to do the very best we can at managing. And that may mean shifting our management regimes. It also means new technology and thinking about species that might be able to exist in new places. Things like creating the Billion Oyster Project in New York, or thinking about how many people's livelihoods are impacted by this. Over half the people on the planet rely on fish for some source of protein, and 600 million people rely on it as a part of their income generation. So we know that we have to take those management steps that are crucial to conserving fish stocks in the face of the other changes that we're seeing. Not to mention cutting back on pollution and doing all the other things we can, like creating marine protected areas, in order to make sure that we have enough fish to feed the planet. So, Sarah, now it's my turn to ask you again. Tell us a little bit about all the things that NOAA is working on to help us understand the ocean better. There is so much of the planet. You know, there's this old saying about how we know more about the moon than we know about the ocean, and it's our own home here on Earth. It's our planet, and we don't know so much about it. We're always discovering new species, which is an amazing thing that there's still so much out there to discover. Tell us about NOAA's exploration efforts and all the things that we know could be helping us in the future, like new things that we discover that might lead to better medicines or other kinds of advancements.
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know, NOAA in our ocean purview, we are going from the bottom of the ocean, mapping the seafloor, all the way to the top of the ocean, understanding what's all in between. And so with that, we have new technologies to be able to collect as much information as possible. Historically, we would send down cameras or look down at the bottom, or we would do fish catches to be able to count the number of fish and then dissect them and see how healthy they are. But increasingly, we're doing less invasive technologies as well. We have omics, which we're taking measurements out of the seawater. When I was over at our laboratory yesterday, they were showing me how now Rice's whale, this whale that is very rare, it's hard to find, we're actually able to take seawater, take a vial of seawater this large and be able to determine if Rice's whale was recently there. And so we're able to know the range of this animal. And it's in this early infancy, but I'm really excited about the expansion of eDNA, like capturing that seawater and figuring out what species were in it, because it allows us to know in remote locations what's there, particularly when you have these types of whales or other species that are otherwise really hard to spot. And actually, on the West Coast, using these vials of water, we're able to replicate those traditional surveys where we catch all the fish for hake. And that's the first time we've been able to do it for any species. And so I'm really excited about the development of that type of technology, which will allow us to know what's happening around the world. And it's also low cost. Taking a vial this small of water, it can be done around the world by many different people without sophisticated, fancy PhDs. You can do it in many of these regions where we're trying to.
It's so hard to count fish. People think it's such as, back to the fisheries question, you know, we're always struggling with how to manage these fish stocks that move around all the time. They don't stand still and let us count them. So this is amazing.
And we can do it with the DNA, and now increasingly we can also do it with acoustics. So if you actually we have microphones all over the ocean where we can listen in, and we can also increasingly use those acoustic sensors to know, is there a large tuna school going by? Where are the whales? What is going on? And this explosion of data and the use of AI to then sift through it is really exciting, because it's going to give us so much more information than we've had historically.
Well, we've had great discussions here this week about the future of aquaculture and the new technologies that are available on that as well. And there's a whole lot of reason to think that the blue economy is one that can be both sustainable and really grow in the future.
Yeah. We sit in the Department of Commerce at NOAA, and we're doing analysis with commerce on what is the future of this. And we see growth in the blue economy going forward as people turn to it, because 17% of the world's proteins come from fish. It is a critical source, and we see the ability for that to grow, particularly when you have droughts or heat waves on land. It is the insurance policy is having the ocean and using the ocean effectively when things aren't going as well on land due to climate variability and change. I wanted to shift on that important point, though, to protecting species to you. There's a new global treaty that was just negotiated to allow countries of the world for the first time to create marine protected areas. These are marine parks on the high seas. Why is this important, and how much more of the ocean do we need to protect, and how are we going to get there?
This is such an exciting topic to me, having worked hard at the United Nations to help negotiate this important agreement. So 70% of the planet is ocean. I'll geek out here a little bit on statistics. Over 50%, or almost 50% of the planet is the high seas, which is the areas in the ocean that are beyond national jurisdiction, where there hadn't been a lot of governance before, and it was very sectoral, very kind of chaotic and disorganized. If you were a shipper, you were covered by certain rules. If you're in fishing on the high seas, you had certain areas that were regulated well. But the rest was just the wild, wild west. And we really need to be protecting a lot of the planet. Another global treaty has been agreed by every country in the world, which is hard to get that kind of agreement, that we're going to protect 30% of the planet by 2030. We're going to try, because that's what scientists tell us we need in order to have a healthy, functioning planet that will provide all the things that we need from nature. So in order to protect 30% of the planet, you have to be able to get to that 50% that's out there beyond law. And this is the first time the countries of the world, again, all got together and said, we want to be able to protect areas as parks out there in the high seas. So right now, only 1% of that area is fully protected, and it's in Antarctica, where we already had a global agreement to protect, and it was very hard to get those protections put in place. So now we have the potential to actually protect that part of the high seas where we know if we don't mine it, drill it, fish it, pollute it, that it can withstand an awful lot of the beating that climate change is taking on those parts of the ocean. So for now, we really need to find ways to get global agreement to actually put some of those places aside. And this agreement for the first time gives us the opportunity to do that. And it was really an amazing thing. We had been negotiating it, the US and all the countries in the world had been negotiating it for over 10 years. And it got to a critical point last February and March. And the negotiators actually negotiated for nearly 2 days straight without a break in order to be able to reach this agreement. And it was fascinating how countries came together at the end, even with their reservations about kind of losing sovereignty and whether they could actually get benefits from all that marine biodiversity. The other big part of the treaty is that it governs how we use biodiversity that's gathered from the high seas that theoretically belongs to everyone on the planet, how we use that and how we all benefit from that marine genetic diversity and all the discoveries that might come from it. So this agreement couldn't be more important, and it couldn't come at a more important time. And now, hopefully, we'll get enough countries to ratify it in the next year, and 2 already have, which is great, but we need about 60 to ratify it in order for it to go into effect. So hopefully, in the next year or so, we'll see that treaty go into effect, and already countries are working together to try to identify the most important parts of the high seas to protect for climate and for fisheries and all the other things that we need from the ocean. So it's a very exciting moment, and I was just thrilled to be a part of it. And we had an incredible US negotiating team, but lots of countries leaned in. So I think, you know, if we had to sum it up, Sarah, I think about the ocean as having so much potential, and I know our former NOAA administrator always says it's too big to ignore and it's too big to let fail. I know that's what you all are focused on every day at NOAA, and I have a lot of hope. I don't know if you feel the same way about the future of the ocean.
Oh, exactly. I say the facts. I say the facts of, like, this is what we face and this is what we see. The thing that I always say is, with that science and information, we know what the future holds. There's not a lot of things, your relationships, politics, society, that we actually have quite a lot of certainty of what the world looks like in the coming years. And so we have to take that information, that crystal ball, and we have to use it. And we know how to use it to create a sustainable ocean, to create and maintain biodiversity and how to conserve, to be able to make a hardy ocean and a healthy ocean for years to come.
There are no ocean solutions without climate solutions, and there are no climate solutions without ocean solutions. So it's been a great conversation. Great. Thanks, Sarah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Please welcome Brad Ringeisen.
Good morning, everybody. They're getting my slides loaded, I promise. How's everybody doing this morning? Good? All right. Let me start today with an unfortunate fact. Agriculture is bad for the climate. Cows and rice emit methane. Fertilizer use results in nitrous oxide emissions, and taken together with things like deforestation, there are publications that have reported close to 1/3 of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions stem from agriculture. At the same time, climate change is also really bad for agriculture. More floods, more droughts, higher peak temperatures, and more pandemics, and not just pandemics for people, but pandemics for plants that could ultimately result in widespread famine. Both of these problems, ag emissions and crop loss due to climate disasters, are just going to get worse as climate change intensifies and the world's expected to add close to 2 billion people in the next 25 years. How are we going to feed close to 10 billion people without destroying the planet? What if I told you we could create a farm that doesn't have any net greenhouse gas emissions? A truly net zero farm. A world where we could grow all the food that we need, even in the face of a changing climate, and be part of the global climate solution. I'm here today to talk to you about CRISPR and how it could do exactly that. I'm the executive director of the Innovative Genomics Institute, the IGI, We're a nonprofit biotech hub on the campus of UC Berkeley. And we were founded by Jennifer Doudna, who won the Nobel Prize for her work in developing CRISPR, a tool that scientists can use to directly edit DNA and change the function of living cells. CRISPR is 2 parts. It has a precise targeting molecule called a guide RNA that allows you to be able to zero in on a specific part of the DNA. And the second part, that's a molecular scissor called Cas9. And when you take these 2 parts together, you're able to zero in on a specific segment of DNA and cut to inactivate a gene, or even paste in DNA segments that can change and correct a disease-causing mutation, or change the trait of cells like plant cells and microbial cells. Now, last year was a big year for CRISPR. Got the first FDA approval for a new CRISPR drug that essentially cures sickle cell disease. It's really remarkable. But what excites me about CRISPR is that it doesn't just have to be relegated to creating new medicines. DNA is in all living organisms. It's the code of life. So why not unlock the power of CRISPR to be able to solve other major problems facing society? And one of those problems is the need to be able to provide food security into the future. IGI scientists have already been working hard on this problem. We can edit over 30 different crops: rice, wheat, sorghum, tomatoes. We can create pathogen-resistant crops by knocking out disease susceptibility genes. We can create drought-tolerant crops by using CRISPR to reduce the number of water-losing pores on the leaves of crops. We're even working to save the banana and chocolate from emerging pathogens. And I promise you, in the coming decades, farmers are going to be using these crops to be able to increase yields, to reduce crop loss, and basically grow more food using less land and less resources. But to make the biggest impact, we also need to use CRISPR to be able to directly try to turn off some of those agricultural emissions. And those emissions, surprisingly, the most of them don't come from tractors and burning fossil fuels. Often they come from tiny microorganisms that live in communities called microbiomes. And those microbiomes are found in places like the gut of a cow and in the soils that we grow crops in. And they result in the emission of potent greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. Now, the worst of these emissions come from cows and livestock. Depending on what publication you read, anywhere between 10 and 20% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions stem from livestock. Now, our collaborators at UC Davis have actually developed a feed additive based on red algae seaweed that actually shows that you can shift and change the microbiome to reduce the amount of methane that's emitted. But it's really difficult to scale and sort of grow around the world, and you have to give it to the cows every single day in order for it to be effective. We're working on a CRISPR treatment that you could potentially dose just once, right as the calf is born, when almost every calf in the world is handled. So we really think we can actually shift the microorganisms to a low methane or even zero methane state and reduce those emissions throughout the entire life of the cow. Now, that brings me to our plan to be able to try to absorb gigatons of atmospheric carbon and put it back into agricultural soils. And we think those soils are a perfect target because they've lost close to 500 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. What if you could use CRISPR to help put that back? Our plan is in 3 parts. We want to use CRISPR to enhance photosynthesis. That'll increase the amount of atmospheric carbon that you take and put it into the biomass of crops. But you can't just stop there. It's more carbon for food and more carbon to store, but a lot of it would just be degraded and put back into the environment. So we're going to try to use CRISPR to put it into more stable forms, like deeper and more dense roots. And the deeper you can put carbon, the more likely it's to stay in soil. And then work with the soil microbiome to try to lock that carbon into nice, organic, fertile soils. Now, we all know the scale of the problem that we have. It's huge. And people are turning to direct air capture. And it's important. We have to do all of these things. but it's energy intensive and difficult to scale. Meanwhile, I tell people that biology already scales, and agriculture means you can put seeds in the ground each and every year and affect change really quickly. So you can see why I'm excited to be at the IGI and realize my vision where global climate emission goals can be met by changing the way we grow food. And it comes with so many different co-benefits: reduced emissions, less atmospheric carbon, more food security, and enabling farmers to grow on marginal and underutilized lands and convert them into more fertile soils, reducing the need for deforestation. So let me leave you with one word, and that's hope. It's easy to lose hope when it comes to climate change, but I'm here to tell you we can make a difference. Scientific innovation can make a difference, and together we can build a more sustainable future. Thank you.
And now, for an announcement from the White House, Maggie Thomas.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Thomas, and I serve as Special Assistant to the President for Climate in the White House. Today, I'm thrilled to make public, for the first time, the logo for President Biden's American Climate Corps. Can I get a drum roll? All right, just kidding. It's not gonna come that easy. We're gonna start in the 1930s. Ooh, that's good. We're gonna start in the 1930s, when President Roosevelt had a radical idea to put millions of young men to work conserving America's natural resources while addressing the unemployment crisis of the Great Depression. Behind me is the logo for that popular public works program, the Civilian Conservation Corps. This logo speaks to a brave and determined generation. But I think we can all agree, in many ways, it represents America's past. Today we face a different crisis, and we have a new, diverse generation ready to get to work. From deploying clean energy to electrify our economy and cut harmful pollution, to harnessing resilient infrastructure to prepare and protect our communities from the climate crisis, and investing in nature-based solutions with a more just and equitable approach rooted in the lived experience of frontline communities to ensure clean air and clean water for all Americans. As President Biden has said, the climate crisis is the existential threat of our time. To make progress, we need to act with the urgency this moment demands. That's why President Biden launched the American Climate Corps, an ambitious new initiative to put young Americans to work fighting the impacts of climate change while training the clean energy and climate resilience workforce of the future. And just last week, in his State of the Union address, the President announced his intention to triple the size of the American Climate Corps by the end of this decade. The American Climate Corps will bring together the energy and enthusiasm of young people with limitless opportunities to tackle the climate crisis and advance environmental justice in communities across the country. Through the American Climate Corps, we're bringing to life a new vision for our country and building on the legacy of FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps. The American Climate Corps' story is yet to be told. It's your story, and we can't wait to have you join us. Thank you.
And now, David Steele.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to spring break in Miami Beach. It's great to see such an audience. It's been amazing a couple of days. So I'm David Steele. I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director of UL Standards and Engagement. We're a nonprofit standards developer, and I'll say a little bit more at the end as we go through this about what exactly these standards are capable of. But today what I really want to focus on is resilience. How do we create greater resilience in the built environment in the face of all the extreme weather that's coming as a result of climate change, and most notably fires? So let me say a little bit. We've heard over the last couple of days quite a lot about extreme weather events. We obviously see now many more hurricanes. We see increasing drought. We see severe precipitation events. You know, this is quite real. And even forecasts suggest that in the coming years, these will actually quadruple. So we need to recognize that this is happening. And we need to be thinking about how do we promote resilience? What are some of the tools that we can use? And that's where we think our standards can actually play a role in that. So turning specifically to the impact of these dry conditions, we see now so many examples of really serious wildfires. And perhaps in the past we felt that this was some very distant phenomenon, that it just affected remote areas or perhaps unpopulated areas. But what we see now more and more is that these fires are coming really to places very close to home. And we're almost running out of superlatives to describe some of these catastrophic and tragic fires. You know, once in a generation, largest ever, unprecedented. These fires are real. They're affecting communities across America and around the world. And even here in Florida, not that far from where we are, we've seen the spread of these wildfires. So they're very, very serious. And we need to be thinking collectively what we do about them. But it's not just coverage on TV. It's also reflected in the statistics when it comes to these billion-dollar disasters. Yes, these big disasters with serious impact for communities on the increase. And we need to be thinking collectively what we can do to address these harms and hazards. Now, when you look at these kind of disasters as they affect communities, oftentimes folks turn to insurance to cover the damage. But now we're seeing more and more the insurance industry starting to get very concerned about these risks and hazards, even to pull back in some cases from particular hazards of wildfires or particular communities, and look sometimes to states or governments to be that kind of insurer of last resort. But surely that's not a sustainable position to be in, to expect states to bankroll these kind of disasters, and we need to think about, again, tools that we can use to deal with these hazards. So that's where I turn to our development of standards. And our organization, UL Standards and Engagement, has been around now for 120 years of developing safety standards. Starting from our very first standard, 1903, which was a standard related to fire doors. So we have that kind of heritage of using standards to think about how we can address various safety hazards. I love this old picture. That's not me in the photo, but you know, going back to those early days, 1903, testing fire doors. And we've continued this great focus on safety science. So our colleagues in UL research institutes do extensive research to understand things like the origin and the spread of fires. Our colleagues in UL Solutions work with companies to help them with their products and solutions to market. But what we do at UL Standards and Engagement is develop these safety standards. We've developed more than 1,700 standards to ensure safety. In fact, the average American home has products that comply with over 100 UL standards. That's just how our standards are out there keeping people safe. And more than 4,000 experts volunteer their time on our technical committees to help us come up with these guidance documents, these standards, to help make communities and homes, transportation and energy more safe. As I mentioned, we started with fire standards. We now have 161 different standards related to fire that address how you prevent ignition, how you prevent spread, how you suppress fires. But using these standards to really inform the way products and communities are designed to reduce that kind of fire risk, especially now with this growth of wildfires. So when you think about the design of a home, for example, you think about the materials that are used in that home. How can we use standards to ensure that the materials used, that the design of the home can safeguard the home, can reduce the spread of those wildfires, can safeguard that vital water pipeline to actually be able to fight some of these fires? And think about that from the very beginning, according to a science-based standards format that helps assure the safety of these communities. Now, most standards are voluntary. There are cases where standards are baked into codes or local regulations, but most standards are voluntary. They rely on manufacturers or communities or other stakeholders embracing that standard and saying, we think this can provide a foundation on which others can innovate. And increasingly, as I said, as insurers back away from taking on this risk, it's going to be more and more, we think, communities that look to the opportunities from standards to say, how can we address this? So just in closing, again, UL Standards and Engagement, we're a nonprofit safety standards developer. I'm really here today to look for partnerships, to look for those of you who are interested in resilience, in the built environment, and in making communities safer. So if you have that interest, please look for me or my colleagues after the session. Would love to have a conversation. Again, thank you and enjoy your spring break.
And now, Hilton Kelly and Navina Sarasivam.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Yes, good morning, Hilton. My name is Navina Sadasivam, and I'm a reporter at GRIST. We're an award-winning nonprofit media organization dedicated to telling stories of climate solutions and a just future. And I'm here with the indomitable Hilton Kelly, an environmental justice leader from Port Arthur, Texas. He is, yeah, give it up for Hilton. He is the founder and director of Community in Power and Development Association, and Hilton really is a force of nature. He's been doing deep community work for more than 2 decades. Many of you may know that he is a Goldman Prize winner for his community work and is an advocate for environmental issues, environmental justice issues in Texas. But what you might not know is that after a stint in the Navy, he did stunt roles in Hollywood. So you may have seen him in Eddie Murphy's movie Metro or maybe Nash Bridges. And then you returned to Port Arthur after your time in Hollywood. So tell us a little bit, Hilton, about what brought you back to Port Arthur after your time in Hollywood.
Okay, well, first of all, good morning, everyone. What brought me back to the city of Port Arthur was the need for someone to speak up for the moderate to low income people of color communities in the west side of Port Arthur, which is right up against the refineries and chemical plants and chemical incineration facilities where we were forced to live during the Jim Crow era. But how it all started was I joined the Navy when I was 19 years old. I was in the service from 1980 to 1986, but I had active duty from 1980 to 84. When I got out of the service in 1984, I decided to stay in California and pursue a career in acting. In high school, I was in theater. I played football as well. But I fell in love with theater, and I ended up doing extras work. That's how I got involved. I was on Nash Bridges, did a lot of stand-in work, did some stunts and whatnot. But I took a sabbatical from that in 2000, and I went home to Port Arthur, Texas, just to visit relatives and friends and to go to the Mardi Gras. It was in February. And when I went back home to Port Arthur, which is located right on the Gulf Coast, I noticed that the air quality had a stench to it, like rotten eggs, and you could smell the chemical odors in the air, like when I was a kid growing up there. And before I ever left Port Arthur, I thought that was normal for the air to have that stench to it until I got to California, and things were a little different. And so I started wondering, why couldn't things be that way in my hometown? But I grew up hearing the language like, well, you know, That's money you smell in the air. My mother used to always say that. And a lot of folks in my town, most of them didn't live past 60 years old, that worked at those facilities, that lived in that African-American community. I mean, literally, we lived on the fence line. And so I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make a change in how our economic system was in West Port Arthur, and I wanted to get that town back in an upward mobility swing and get rid of some of the dilapidated buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I noticed from visiting you in Port Arthur is that people are being hit by two twin threats. So there's the petrochemical industry, and like you said, frontline community living in the shadow of these massive refineries, but you're also on the Gulf Coast, which is periodically getting hit by hurricanes. So what effect have you seen that cumulative burden of both the hurricanes and the petrochemical industry have on your neighbors, on your friends, and the community at large?
Well, when it comes to living in West Port Arthur, or Port Arthur period, and on the Gulf Coast, hurricanes is now a way of life. Growing up in Port Arthur, I remember the first hurricane I ever heard of was Hurricane Carla back in 1965. I was born in 1960. I'm 63 now. I started doing this work in 2000. I was 39 years old. So now I've been in this fight for 24 years. I was very naive when I got into this work. I thought I can go into Port Arthur, help solve those issues, and head back to California, but nothing could be further from the truth. This is a lifelong mission, fighting for environmental justice and fighting for people's right to drink clean water and breathe, clean air. But living on the Gulf Coast has its challenges. It's very stressful. Every year we deal with the threats of hurricanes, we deal with the threats of flooding, we deal with the threats of homelessness, because many times when hurricane hits, for instance, the last big hurricane we got hit by was Hurricane Harvey. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey devastated Port Arthur, Texas. 80% of Port Arthur, Texas was inundated with water, even in what they call no-flood neighborhoods, so-called because we were on higher ground. But Harvey was an exceptional storm. And right after Hurricane Harvey, there was Hurricane Laura that was earmarked, they said on the Weather Channel, that was coming to Port Arthur, but it veered to the east and ended up devastating Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is right next to Port Arthur. Now, what comes with that when you don't get a direct hit from a hurricane, FEMA doesn't even look at your community, even though those winds basically still destroyed Port Arthur, even though it wasn't a direct hit. Roofs were torn off, okay? Gates were knocked down, windows were blown out, but yet we could get no support. And even to this day, many people are still living in homes that was damaged way back when Hurricane Rita hit, right after Hurricane Katrina. And like I said, growing up in Port Arthur, we didn't see many hurricanes. They always hit further south down in the Corpus Christi area. But now what we're seeing every year are at least 3 to 4 hurricane warnings a year. And the hurricane season starts, I think, around June, and it goes all the way up into October. And so the stress that brings to a community that is hurricane prone, that is flood prone, and not to mention the chemicals that get mixed in the flood waters, it's very, very stressful, and it's very, very difficult to deal with every year.
Right, so let's talk a little bit about those chemicals that you talked about. What effect have you seen on people's health in living both in an area that is often hit by hurricanes, but also in the shadow of these refineries that when a hurricane hits, they are sometimes leaking chemicals into the water, shutting down very quickly and emitting a lot of pollution into the air. What effect has that had on the people in the community?
Well, it's had a devastating impact on our health. As a matter of fact, many times when there's flood waters in the neighborhood, you don't have any choice but to get in that water and walk, because now your cars are useless, your trucks are useless. So in order to get to higher ground or to rescue vehicles, you have to get in the water. And sometimes that water has a sheen of oil in it, because what the groundwater that's on the plant ground sometimes wash into the community. And whenever you have flooding and you have hurricanes, well, the refineries and chemical plants have to go into what you call shutdown mode. And whenever they go into shutdown mode, what you see is these huge flares off the top of these derricks. I mean, sometimes it's like 20, 30 flares going off at one time. It almost looked like the invasion of Kuwait, if you will. And we live right next to the largest oil refinery in the Northern Hemisphere, which is called Motiva. Motiva put out 635,000 barrels of oil per day. And right next to Motiva is Valero. And right next to Valero, we have Chevron Chemical. Next to Chevron Chemical, we have Oxbow Calcining, petroleum coke facility. And next to them, we have Veolia Chemical Incineration Facility. We have Cheniere LNG, Sabine LNG. So the question must be asked, how much is too much for one community? And I must add, again, this is an African-American community where African-Americans were forced to live during the Jim Crow era, and we still live there today because it's all, many of what those citizens in that community have. I grew up in West Port Arthur, but yet we are disproportionately impacted by this onslaught of pollution and threats by hurricanes in our community because it is a low-lying area, almost like the Mississippi Delta. And so we learn to survive in these areas, but yet at the same time, your body can only take so much. Moving back to the Port Arthur in 2000, to date, I've had at least 6 of my personal close friends perish from cancer. And I'd like to mention 1 or 2. Eddie Brown, you guys do not know him, but he was a pillar in the community. He was diagnosed with cancer in 2018, and he died in 2021, right after the big freeze we had in the city of Port Arthur. Also, Darlene Ford, very good friend of mine, a classmate of mine, graduated in 1978. She passed away. Quite a few others have passed, and this is why I continue to fight, and this is what prompted me to get more involved and continue to push thus far.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. You know, you said you've been working on this for more than 2 decades, 24 years. What changes have you observed in the community? Are things improving? Are there hopes? Are there signs of progress? Or what changes overall have you observed in the last 2 decades?
Well, I must add, some of the things that have changed for the better is over the years, we've had to use litigation to bring forward action. And my attorney, Jim Blackburn, who has worked with me for many, many years with the Blackburn law firm, we were able to bring lawsuits against Motiva, where we were able to get a $5.2 million settlement for the impacted community. We started a clinic on the west side of Port Arthur to help those people that have transportation barriers and other barriers to keep them from going to the clinic on the far east end of town. We have a development center, and I'd like to say many, many thanks to the then administration under Barack Obama. Lisa Jackson was head of the EPA during the time of this lawsuit back in 2012. And there was a consent decree that was posed against the Valero oil refinery. And that money that they had to pay due to some of the illegal emission releases, well, it went to the national treasure. But we spoke with the Environmental Protection Agency back then, and they agreed that some of that money should come back to the impacted communities that had to bear the brunt of all this illegal pollution. And with those funds that was allocated back to the community, we were able to build a clinic to help those people that are still in the community fighting for their lives. So that's one major thing, but at the same time, we also got the Valero oil refinery and Motiva to put in flare gas recovery units, sulfur recovery units, and also now they've come into compliance because of our actions. So we're very excited about those accomplishments.
That's excellent. That's really great. I know you have a poem that you wanted to share with us. If you would like to, we'd love to hear it.
Well, thank you for that. Well, yeah, I mean, you know, when I first moved back home to Port Arthur, you know, I was so angry because, you know, of all the odors that were still there, the dilapidated situation. Many of the kids were playing in the parking lots. And I was just so angry because we are on the fence line of billion-dollar-a-year companies, but yet our community is still behind in time. And the buildings are dilapidated, and there's a heavy unemployment, 14% unemployment. So one night, I was sitting in my little bungalow, and I heard this huge explosion. It was at one of the plants. And so I like to write, and I write poetry, and I wrote this one poem called My Toxic Reality to release some of the pressure that I was feeling. And I'm going to share that with you.
Absolutely.
My toxic reality. I see your smoke rising in the air, 2, 3 in the morning when you think no one is there. In the still of the night, my child starts to sneeze. In the still of the night, the other starts to wheeze. Your bright, bright torch, it burns all night. To find my way through the house, I don't even need a light. The roar of your flame I've learned to ignore, even though its combustion vibrate my feet up on the floor. Now, I know I live at the back end of town, and I should just be quiet and not make a sound. You might even find this a little profound, but me and my neighbors are a light and dark shade of brown. I hope our leaders don't conspire to circumvent, because these findings I have a sulfur benzene scent. Excuse me while I cough. My throat has a slight tickle. The air I breathe, it smells and sometimes very fickle. If you went to take a bath and saw a rash up on your chest, would you just shrug your shoulders and wish yourself the best? Because this money they give is great, and this is only flesh. But if you had the right insurance, you could go and take a test. Oh, I'm scared I'll lose my job if the pollution I contest. But if you died tonight, would your killers confess to the poison they put inside you that laid you down to rest? Would your family have to fight to pay your doctor bills as you lay 6 foot under up on a grassy hill? Now your job is gone and your company grievance has faded. Your spouse and kids tried to collect from them, but they said your death was not job related. My toxic reality, my toxic reality, my toxic reality.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We'll have to leave it there. A big round of applause for Hilton Kelly, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome our next group of speakers to the stage.
Good morning, I'm Gary Nell, and I'm co-chairing the Aspen Institute's Planet Media, along with Catherine Hayhoe.
And I'm Amy Friedman, member of the Planet Media Task Force.
So we know that many young people are worried about climate change, and all too often they hear about doom and gloom. Media has the power to reach children no matter where they live, and a campaign focused on science, hope, and solutions can reduce worry and empower young people with the knowledge that they need. We teamed up with the Nature Conservancy to kidify 4 essential climate principles. Earth is our home, it's getting hotter because of us, it's changing now and impacting us, but together we can make the changes we need for a brighter future. Now we are unleashing these principles across all kids' media and all kids' platforms. This will help us shift the narrative away from doomerism towards hope and solutions.
In January, we put out a call to the children's media community to pitch their ideas to use those 4 climate principles to create their own original short-form content. And we were absolutely blown away by the response. In just a month, we received over 200 submissions. From those, we selected 7 finalists to come down to Miami and pitch their ideas in front of a very crowded room and a very esteemed panel of judges. And today, we are really thrilled to announce the awardees. First, the judges selected 2 creators who will receive awards of $20,000 to support their content creation. They're Robbie Ledoux and Erica Rabner for Cold Sweat, a live-action, song-centered drama series about a Texas tween who inadvertently becomes a climate vlogger. And Lindsay Owen for Solar Punks, featuring an animated crew of time-traveling heroes who help kids find solutions to ecological problems, and it's all set in a beautiful utopian solar punk future. And now, the winner, who receives an award of $40,000 to create their show. You already started the drum roll. Awesome. Here it goes. Yo Zeno. Young Park and Nak Choi for Yo Zeno, an anime-style project starring a rebellious space prince who comes to Earth and learns about the importance of collective action and stewardship. Congratulations to everybody.
Hi, I'm Susie Jaramillo, CEO of Encantos and proud Planet Media Task Force member. Our team at Encantos partnered with Planet Media to create a pilot episode of a new digital series called This is Cooler, which takes place right here in Miami. With This is Cooler, we wanted to teach kids the core climate principles, help them see how climate is impacting them and their local communities, and understand what they can do about it, and what adults are already doing, and make it fun and funny for kids. What you're about to see is a portion of the Miami episode where we focus specifically on exchanging climate change. At the end, you can use the QR code to get a sneak peek for the full film, which includes a highlight on real-life climate hero Gianna Hutton Gonzalez, a former Miami-Dade student who started a composting effort across Miami schools. For the full film, to go live just in time for Earth Month, and we're really working hard to bring This is Cooler to cities across the country. I also wanted to add that we had the wonderful opportunity to partner with a very special friend of Miami and Aspen Ideas Climate. So please enjoy the video, and if you feel so moved, get on your feet, get up and make it happen.
Whoa, the heat is really on.
Yeah, like too much.
Thanks a lot, Gloria Stefan.
Whoa. This isn't Gloria's fault.
Yeah, the heat is on, but that's on all of us.
Who are you?
I'm Zoe.
And I'm Kai.
And we're the cool crew.
Wait, aren't you not cool if you say you're cool?
Just go with it. So, like, ¿qué pasa with climate change, bro?
Well, what do y'all think is going on?
It's getting hotter because of pollution.
It's grown-ups' fault. They dropped the ball.
Hey! Oh.
It's out of control. We can't stop it. We're doomed.
Okay. Story time.
This is the Earth.
Duh.
Shh, there's more.
Sorry.
The Earth has an invisible blanket around it. That's the atmosphere. It's made up of heat-trapping gases that trap just the right amount of heat to create the perfect climate for us. Not too hot, not too cold.
Like Goldilocks.
Yeah, but also, shh.
Humans are adding more heat-trapping gases to the blanket. From how we power on, how we get around, how we make things, how we grow food, and how we live. This makes the blanket thicker, which makes the planet hotter.
A hotter planet changes our climate, which is different from our day-to-day weather. Over time, wet becomes wetter, dry becomes drier, hot becomes hotter. Storms, floods, and wildfires become more dangerous.
Our world is changing, but together, we can make the changes we need for a brighter future. Miami Beach may be in danger, but we're doing everything we can to take care of her. So in the future, she's way cooler. Isn't that right, Miami?
That's right. It's me, the city of Miami. I am so impressed with your generation. You want to do something? You get it done. Thank you for caring for our Earth, Miami, and our beaches. And with your help, we're going to turn this heat around. Hit it!
Come on and take a stand as I sing this song. God, no, you can't control this climate any longer. Feel the heat and hurricanes getting stronger. Lots of little actions can be the change we need. Gather round now, listen to me. There's all together too much heat. It's getting hotter, there's too much water, and it's been flooding up the street. Time to make some way better choices about the things you buy and eat.
Okay, so we have some big news here that we're thrilled to announce that National Cinemedia, which is the largest cinema advertising platform in the US, is going to highlight all this work and the Planet Media as the Planet Media exclusive cinema marketing sponsor. Starting in May, they're going to show and promote all this work of Planet Media in theaters across America. Thank you so much.
Please welcome Bernadette Plackey and John Morales.
Morning. Morning.
Well, hello, everybody.
Good morning. Buenos
How you
dias.
doing? Got some energy? Great. So we are so honored to be joining you today. They gave us a session to talk about our favorite subject, weather. And so I'm joined by John Morales. And I'd like to start by giving a little background because I don't think they understand the legend that I'm sitting with right now.
So I've been a broadcast meteorologist in this market, the Miami, Fort Lauderdale market, for 33 years en Español, en Univision, en Telemundo, and then on to NBC, where I was chief meteorologist since 2009 till 2022. Now I'm their hurricane specialist, so I'm only on for tropical cyclones. And in addition to daily weather broadcasts and such, I also communicate quite a bit on climate and have provided for probably a couple of decades a lot of climate context in my weather presentations on television and also on social media platforms.
And so a little bit of my background is being a meteorologist. I did operational forecasting and a lot of TV myself, then came over to Climate Central to do our work with TV meteorologists to help people understand how the climate is changing and make these connections. And so what we wanted to start with today is this theme that's been brought into this year's conference about narratives of change. We're actually flipping that a little bit because meteorologists are changing the narratives. And we wanted to make that an actionable verb. And the thing is, there's a few reasons why meteorologists are powerful communicators on climate change. So why don't you start with a little bit of that?
Well, listen, we are provided so many opportunities on a daily basis to enter people's living rooms, or for that matter, maybe for the late news, their bedrooms. And people have learned, frankly, to trust the weathercasters, and there's actual research on that, on how much people trust weathercasters in terms of the information that they deliver, especially when they're looking for a trusted science source. So the general public will actually look at their broadcast meteorologist as their most trusted source of scientific information. So we have a terrific opportunity to be able to communicate the state of the science of climate change to an audience really on a daily basis if the opportunity arises. Studies have shown as well that when an audience is provided climate context in these weather segments, we actually wrote a paper together about that. When they're provided climate context in the weather segments, people internalize and personalize the threat to the point where they're empowered to demand action on climate. So, broadcast meteorologists have become a really important facet of being able to spur action on climate.
And they're also living on the front lines of our changing climate. Weather is one of the primary ways that people experience climate change. And I think we have Tony Leisowitz here with us too. And him and his partner at George Mason University have done so much research on the trusted messenger aspect, but also what is changing opinion on climate change, and weather is one of those ways that people are opening up their minds, they're experiencing things in different ways, and they actually can be moved forward on their understanding of our changing climate. So getting a little bit deeper into the complex science and making it simple and bringing it to people. I mean, backstage we were talking about so many different examples, but take us through some of what you've experienced and how you've been able to process that.
In recent years, the number of extreme weather events, which are oftentimes attributed to the changing climate, have been multiplying. So the opportunities for a broadcast meteorologist to be on air and provide that climate context. And listen, it's as simple as saying, you know what we just observed there? And it might be a heat wave, like the one that Miami lived through during this last summer, the worst, hottest summer that Miami has ever had in terms of apparent temperature or feels like temperature, topping 105 degrees for I don't know how many, double the number of hours over the previous record, right? So it might be a heat wave, it might be an extreme rainfall event, it might be rapid intensification in a hurricane. When these events occur, the broadcast meteorologist can get on air and simply state what we just observed is consistent with what you would expect on a warming planet. And I can leave it at that. It can be as simple as that statement. But the audience starts to realize, oh yeah, I remember 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I had seen some news that scientists had predicted that we would get more heat waves, or that it would rain stronger, or maybe 30 years ago there wasn't as much research on how many rapid intensification cycles we would see in tropical cyclones, but of course, sadly and scary, that we're learning that now in the present era. So that's just some of the ways that we do that. You know, a good example of these rapid intensification cycles last year, Hurricane Otis, just before striking Acapulco. 24 hours prior to landfall, mundane tropical storm. When it made landfall, it was a Category 5 hurricane. Unpredicted, hit a deep pool of very hot water close to the coast, rapidly intensified, and Acapulco got hit really hard with fatalities and an immense amount of damage in that area. And I, sitting here in South Florida, still on air, being a hurricane specialist for NBC6, I fear that there's going to come a day when we're going to have a mundane tropical storm in the central Bahamas that 36 hours later is going to make landfall in Miami as a Category 3 or 4 or 5 hurricane, Category 4 or 5 hurricane. That will happen someday. And it's changed the way that I communicate the threat. Because a mundane tropical storm in the central Bahamas might have been a trigger for me to kind of calm people down and say, you know, listen, it's a tropical storm, worst case scenario might be a Category 1. Now we don't know. Now it can ramp up to a Category 3 or Category 4. And these are some of the threats that we're seeing with the changing climate that are important to communicate to an audience.
And it also highlights the importance of science and data. I mean, there's so much fundamental that we know about the science and data when it comes to our changing climate. And we do need to move forward on solutions. However, we still need science and data to drive that communication forward.
Absolutely. I mean, a good example of that, part of the reason that that forecast for Hurricane Otis was, far from the best, was lack of data. The Hurricane Hunter aircraft, the ones that fly into the core of the hurricanes, those missions are not flown as often in the Eastern Pacific Ocean as they're flown in the Atlantic Basin. The National Hurricane Center 2 weeks ago came out with their report on Hurricane Otis, their post-mortem on the storm. And they noted that had they had more data, they might have been able to pick up on the developing tropical cyclone, how quickly it was intensifying, and maybe provide a better warning for Acapulco. So data is key, but we can't slam people over the head with textbooks, right? So it's up to meteorologists, weathercasters, to communicate science and data in layman fashion so that people can really understand it. And that's really on us. I think we do a great job, generally speaking, and communicate science in simple ways. But what we're not doing enough of is having more people that provide that climate context on weather segments on TV. It's growing, but I mean, 20 years ago when I started to do it, there might have been 3 or 4 of us doing it. Now there's a few more, but there's not enough broadcast meteorologists with the courage that it takes to be able to do that.
I'd say there's a little more than a few more. No one's quite at John's level. I mean, he's super impressive. But the network has grown pretty considerably. There's still more to be done, though. I mean, through our Climate Matters work, we're now up to 1,000 local TV meteorologists across the country and 2,000 local journalists who are bringing this into their work. Again, still more to be done. Another aspect of where the data science is taking us is another thing we wanted to get into a little bit is, this is a really fun aspect of the science, when you like science, which we do, is attribution science. And this is the area where we can now go into individual events, extreme weather events, and assess the role of climate change within those events. And attribution science has evolved tremendously over the past 20 years, to the point we can get rapid analysis on specific types of storms and how much more likely or how much more intense that storm was because of climate change. And now as technology and science continues to push forward, we're at a point where we can do daily temperature attribution, and we can bring this into weathercasts, and we can bring this into general conversation. Any of you can access this. Go to climatecentral.org, the Climate Shift Index. You can look anywhere in the world at the role of climate change within individual temperatures. And that science is so fun because it's now getting to applications of how much health impact we're getting or economic impact we're getting. It's actually getting pulled into litigation. It's getting pulled into loss and damage conversations. And the one other fun aspect of data and science is weather is also a solution. It's not just a problem, but think about this. Wind, solar, hydro, this is weather. So weather, see, we love weather. Weather is a way of not only understanding how our climate is changing, but what we can do to be part of the solution. So we only have a couple of minutes left, and we wanted to leave you with some examples of what we've learned in this process, because anyone can be a communicator in this room. I mean, we're with a lot of leaders right now as it is, but we really want to help people unlock that power to have conversations, because climate communication is a solution. So a little bit of what we've learned during the time, I'll say from our example with Climate Matters work, is know your audience. We all know a ton about climate change, but most of society knows something's happening. They don't understand what, and they don't understand what exactly they can do. There's a huge gap between what we know and what the general public knows. And all of the research shows they want to know, other than a very small percent. But 90% of society is interested in learning more, and we have the ability to bring that to them. 2, real quick before, because he's got the best one. 2, meet people where they are. Connect on shared values. There's so much more that brings us together than divides us, so don't always focus on that. Focus on what brings us together. And sadly, climate change is affecting most things, but that's an avenue to open up, tell a story, make it local, make it personal. And the other aspect that's really important here too is this is your line, so I'm holding it for you.
Oh, my, yeah. This is a time like no other to be courageous. This is the time to talk about this subject matter. Listen, don't be afraid. 3 in 4 Americans accept the state of the science of climate change. It's not as controversial as you think. Strike up those conversations. And listen, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but strike up the conversations with those outside of your immediate comfort zone, so that the more we talk about this subject, the more it's going to become a priority in people's minds, and people are going to demand action on climate from their elected leaders and other organizers and community leaders in their areas. It can be, you know, despite the Thursday night's kitchen table conversation, it should be a kitchen table conversation, because it's that important, right? It's the biggest priority, in my opinion, as a scientist of the 21st century, and it needs immediate action.
So weather is one of those ways to strike a conversation with someone else, and as he said, be courageous. Don't be afraid. You have science on your side. You have public opinion on your side. Most people want to learn more, so use this opportunity to have those conversations. So thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you go forward and start some conversations on climate change.
Have a great day.
And now, Adam Met.
Hello. I wear a variety of different hats, even though I'm not wearing a hat today. But one of my hats that I wear is that I'm a musician. I spend a lot of time on the road. Next week, I'm starting rehearsals for a 48-city US tour where we're visiting arenas across the country. But that's not the hat that I want to talk about. I want to talk about my other hat. A few years ago, I finished my PhD in human rights law and sustainable development. I teach climate campaigning at Columbia, and I run an organization called Planet Reimagined, where we turn research into advocacy and then turn that into action. Now, a couple of years ago, I spent a lot of time in Congress. I walked around the halls of Congress, meeting with different members, thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act and getting to a place where we could get it passed. And thankfully, we were able to pass it. But at the same time, yes, yeah, go for the Inflation Reduction Act. At the same time, I was sitting down with both Republicans and Democrats. And I spent about a year really listening to what they wanted to do about climate. And I know you might be surprised to hear that I sat down with Republicans, but I learned a lot just from listening for this year. And this idea of transitioning is going to require both Republicans and Democrats all the way across the political spectrum. So I want to tell you a story about us finding common ground between these two sides of politics. So, like this says up here, a transition requires all these different types of stakeholders. And in listening, I found this overlap, and this overlap was around this idea of land use. So I went back to Planet Reimagined, and we did a massive analysis to look at the oil and gas land in the United States. And again, you might be surprised that we were looking at oil and gas land, but we found about 23 million acres of oil and gas land, federal oil and gas land in the United States. Then we overlaid that map with photovoltaic potential. Then we overlaid that map with annual wind speed to figure out if we could put renewable energy on top of current oil and gas land to help those companies transition faster. And we found that there was so much potential here. So, there's so many reasons why this works. I'm going to run through a few of them really quickly. Environmental reviews, for those of you who don't know, are incredibly long and incredibly tedious. If we're looking at this land that already has oil and gas on it, the environmental review process has already been done. Even if it's not the same type of environmental review process, the data has already been collected, so it cuts years out of the permitting process. Number two is the space. If you think about it, we're looking to put solar and wind on a whole bunch of virgin land across the western United States. By looking at current oil and gas land, we're putting it on pre-disturbed land. We're saving a whole bunch of land that we can conserve by putting renewables on top of current oil and gas. The next piece is equity. And this was a really important thing for me to learn. In the West, so much of the revenue from oil and gas ends up funding schools and hospitals. And a lot of these leaseholders are afraid that the school funding and the hospital funding is going to decrease as we're moving away from fossil fuels. We found a way through renewables to fill the gap in that budget. And then lastly, was the most surprising thing for me. Did you all know that 83% of oil producers and 90% of natural gas producers in the United States have 12 employees or less? It's not the Exxons and Chevrons of the world. It's these small leaseholders, these wildcatters in the West. So we are helping these small business owners transition. So these four reasons are why this idea makes a lot of sense. Now, I want to just kind of recap these four ideas so you can think about it as I tell you about the process of bringing Republicans and Democrats together. So, of course, we're going to bring down the carbon footprint on these public lands. We can reduce emissions. the increased speed in permitting, which obviously is something that we need. We're going to keep more land wild, and it's a new lease on life for these energy communities that are losing jobs and losing funding for both education and hospitals. So, how did we do this? We went to Congress, and we found members of Congress that were interested in this idea because it helped people. When I sat down with Democrats, I was talking emissions reduction, which makes sense. When I sat down with conservatives, I was talking about jobs in their district. I was talking about energy security, and I was talking about transforming people's lives. And that's a message that they understood. When I was talking to Democrats, I used the words renewable energy. When I was talking to conservatives, I used the words clean energy. They're two different languages for selling the same policy. So, we got Republicans and Democrats together to sign a letter to the Department of Interior saying, hey, can we do this? Is this possible? Based on all the research that we did at Planet Reimagined. And as of 3 days ago, we got a response from the Department of Interior that officially says, yes, we can now move forward putting renewables on oil and gas land. Now, I'm sure some of you are in the energy space, so you might have this question. How does it make sense to get utility scale solar or wind on these small leases that have just 12 employees? We thought about that. So, we thought of this model of creating consortiums. So right now, this next step is we are working with small leaseholders in the West, in places like New Mexico, in Colorado, in Utah, creating consortiums of these small leaseholders, putting them together, and then creating purchasing power agreements with the large utility scale solar and wind. So each individual doesn't have to negotiate themselves, but then there's huge potential across these places for new renewable energy. And so what's the next step? The next step is this idea of co-locating renewables on top of oil and gas can be applied in so many different places. And like we said, it saves energy, saves time, and saves money because we can reuse old infrastructure. Whether it's geothermal, looking at state land, federal land, looking at offshore, think about it. So many offshore oil rigs, we can put renewables, we can put wind on top of it. So this idea of reusing and looking at how we can save money and how we can save energy is an incredibly important way for bringing Republicans and Democrats together and finding common ground. If you want to learn more, feel free to scan the QR code. Thank you all so much for listening.
And now for our final conversation, Lisa Jackson with Dina Capiello.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thanks for being here on the last day of Aspen Ideas Climate. My name is Dina Capiello. I am the Chief Communications Officer for RMI, and for those who don't know what that is, it was founded about 40 years ago as the Rocky Mountain Institute, and we are based all over the world now, 700 strong, advancing market-based climate solutions with our data and analysis. I am so happy and honored to be joined by my old friend, Lisa Jackson. Old buddies. I covered her when she was EPA administrator in the Obama administration as an AP journalist, so tracked her career, and I'm thrilled to be reconnected today. She needs no introduction. I'll do it briefly because we're short on time. She was the first EPA administrator under President Barack Obama, our nation's first Black EPA administrator too, and now she is at Apple, where she's the VP for Environment Policy and Social Initiatives, and I could not be more thrilled to be having a conversation with her. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
So I've been here for the last couple of days, and there's been a lot of discussion about how we're running out of time and how to address and accelerate the transition that is already underway in many parts of the world. And there's been kind of folks who have pushed policy, let's do it by policy, and folks who have pushed private sector initiative. You've been on both sides of that fence. Prior to EPA, you were in my home state of New Jersey, another connection we have as the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. What have you learned over the years? What are, between policy and now at Apple being a private company, what are the pluses and minuses of those two pathways, and what have you gleaned from that?
Yeah, well, I think the largest lesson is one we hear a lot of, but I'm living, walking proof. We need both. We need all. You know, we'll talk a little bit about America's All In, but you need policymakers, you need local and federal and national and supranational, but you also need the private sector, and of course you need NGOs. And the private sector has a really specific role to play, which is to do it, to actually do the work within our own corporate entities, if you will, but more importantly, and we'll talk about this, in the supply chain. That is where the work really hits the ground and makes a huge difference, and that's really the major amount of the work that we'll be doing at Apple between now and 2030.
I'm going to follow up on that because you know I can't resist, which is, do you think one's more effective or are they equally effective? Is one easier or is one harder?
I think the one that's indispensable is policy. Okay. Because voluntary actions are wonderful, leadership is extraordinary. I'm very proud of the work that I lead at Apple and that we do at Apple, but without governments who are setting the floor and setting the rules and requirements, you're always going to have this kind of patchwork of leaders and laggards, and that's not going to get us there.
Great. You mentioned some of the work at Apple and alluded to it. We're 6 years away, it's amazing, from Apple's really bold 2030 goal of being 100% carbon neutral across your value chain. You're already carbon neutral within your own footprint, but I'm talking about the suppliers across the whole value chain. How confident are you that that goal will be achieved in 6 years? I mean, 6 years is a fast period of time. And
it really
what
is.
steps are you doing now to achieve that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the work, first off, how confident am I? I'm confident, but it wasn't an easy goal. Like, it's a stretch goal. And so it will require a lot of hard work and a lot of things to continue to move forward. Not the least of which is policy, because one of the things we need is for there to be more clean energy available on grids around the world for our users. If you own an Apple product, when you plug it in, we want that to be powered by clean energy as well. And so we need help from sort of the policymakers and other apparatchiks, the PSUs, the utility commissions. And so, but the real work has to be happening now. In order to have a supplier running on clean energy by 2030, you have to have done most of the work with them well before 2030. They just can't decide on January 1st, 2030, hey, let me plug into a different grid. These are big industrial operators. And so that's why the work is really happening now. We have over 300 of our suppliers who have signed up and are running, many of them already running on 100% clean energy for all their Apple production. 13.7 gigawatts of energy on grids, new clean energy to serve their needs. We have commitments of 20 gigawatts. All that in, the time basically since we announced the goal in 2020. So we are running at 2030 as quickly as we can and trying to bring our suppliers along with us at that same fast pace.
Yeah. You mentioned it was a stretch goal, and in preparation for this, I did take a look at your annual report and where you guys are, and you're very candid about you can't eliminate all emissions. There's just some things that you can't eliminate now. And as a consequence, under your leadership, Apple has invested in nature-based solutions, and we know that that hasn't come without scrutiny, right? Are those emissions going to be permanently out of the atmosphere? You know this. You've heard all of this. Can you explain your thinking there and why that's an important approach right now for Apple to take?
Yeah, and Dina, when I was at EPA, I have a particularly huge spot in my heart for community-based work, because I think for so long communities that have the most to lose in climate change have been left out of the equation. And so when we looked across, and we're a technology company, so believe me, we love technologies that suck carbon from the air and do all this work, but when we looked at where we could invest, we thought it was important for a company the size and scope of ours to also invest in communities and to do work on nature-based carbon removal. And we actually have an announcement out just today where 2 of our suppliers are joining us, because what we were hoping to do is catalyze private sector engagement in good projects that are actually doing wonderful work. The ones today are in Paraguay and Brazil. But we spend a lot of time telling the community benefits of those projects. Who are the foresters who are involved in afforestation? How do we manage the managed part of a forest that is actually able to, you know, sell lumber and timber, which is still sequestered, by the way, and yet make a profit, but still preserve and reforest parts that had been clear cut. And so that's the really important work. I want to really stress one other thing, though. Carbon removal means nothing if you haven't done the work of mitigation first. So if you haven't mitigated your emissions and aren't doing everything you can there, then you shouldn't be starting with carbon removal. We've mitigated, you know, our goal is 75% of our emissions have to be gone based on our baseline before we can count the removal. And the removal are for things we can't right now see a path to for 2030, like logistics, a huge piece for us, and some direct emissions of like F-gases and other things where we're working on process changes, but it's going to take technology and innovation.
Yeah, I have to say when I was reading that, we're very similar and aligned at RMI, where CDR, any kind of carbon removal, is not an excuse for business as usual. We have to get the emissions down first.
Yeah, and I don't like the fact that those who are doing that, exactly what you said, are making it hard for companies that really are trying to invest in great projects and making it hard for great projects, because the reaction has been, in my mind, too far the other way. Well, we won't do any carbon removal projects, especially nature-based ones, because they can be so shady. No, we should insist on standards for nature-based work. Otherwise, we're not investing in Latin America, in South America, where there are forests that need to be saved from destruction and where we can't get that carbon back.
Yeah, and that's been a real theme here, which is just very holistic. It's not just about climate. It's not just about reducing emissions. It's benefiting the communities in a much more holistic way, whether that's jobs, economy, et cetera. And I know you and I traveled together many, many years ago back to your neighborhood in New Orleans, where you grew up, after Hurricane Katrina, when you were at EPA administrator. So you know in New Orleans what the story was and who was most affected by that climate disaster. And it was a climate disaster well before we had very numerous climate disasters. You have done a lot of things, obviously. And I've never asked you this question, which is kind of shocking to me. But in your whole career, what is the achievement that you're most proud of? Which one do you think has had the biggest impact? And I know it's not just you. I know it's the amazing people around you, the you know, whoever you're working with. But
yeah, I mean, I guess I have to pick a tie. Look, the work at EPA is, I was 25 years in public service. People now know me and meet me at Apple, and I was like, hold it, you know, I had a life before. And I started at EPA as a staff level engineer, and eventually President Obama named me to run the EPA, one of really the greatest honor I could ever imagine. I would say, you know, the endangerment finding that first year in 2009, which gave the authority and well-versed in the law for EPA to be able to regulate greenhouse gases as in danger to human health and welfare. Also the mercury rule, you know, the incredibly, thanks. All the folks at EPA who worked on that deserve a huge round of applause. And then the mercury rule, because mercury is one of those co-contaminants that just travel along with coal-fired, with coal when you burn it. And you know, this idea that somehow we should only worry about carbon and not worry about the communities that are impacted on the fence line was a big deal. And then probably the work on environmental justice. At Apple, I would say, look, you know, Apple is the scope of EPA in many ways. I don't want to sound, I want to be humble about it, but when we make a change in our supply chain, we know our supply chain is not just changing for us. And so I'm happy if they move to clean energy for Apple, but they keep clean energy for all of our competitors in the world. It's the work of leadership, and it's the work we have to do.
That's great. I was actually there for that Mercury announcement. You did it at Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C.
I still have that picture of that adorable kid. See, I don't know if you or AP might have taken it. Yeah, one a day.
There's a lot of folks in the audience and at this conference that work for different corporations, nonprofits, government officials. What advice, Apple's a really big company, right, with a lot of resources. I think, I'm not going to ask, but I'm sure almost everybody in this room has an Apple iPhone or an Apple Watch. What other advice, if you were smaller, not kind of as big as Apple, would you have for folks in the audience to make change on this and to push forward on the energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, first I would say, take care of yourselves. That sounds crazy, but this is hard. It's exhausting. It's meant to wear us all down. Keep hope, keep the optimism, because you can't work from a place when you don't feel that. And then this is going to sound really trite, but you have to do everything you can but where you are. So the challenge for me is to do actions that live up to the scope and breadth of Apple, right? To challenge ourselves with a 2030 goal that is as big as people who love Apple expect us to be, and then to do everything we can to make it happen. But you might not be at Apple. So what's the big, hairy thing that might seem tiny to you that makes a difference wherever it is you are? Whether that's running a home, whether that's at a school, whether that's in your place of work. I mean, it sounds a little silly, but do everything you can everywhere you can is the advice I give, but do it in a way that actually generates more optimism in you so that you feel like the changes you're making actually add up and are part of something. Just imagine you're working on the most important project ever, because you are. You really are. And we should all thank you for that.
I love that message of optimism. I mean, you've been at this a long time, right? And
long time.
And I'm sure that there are times where you're like, why am I not making more change, right? We have about a minute left, and I want to ask you kind of a prickly question. I'm not going to mention names, but there's probably a lot in the audience worried about the political election in this country. There is political elections happening, significant ones all across the world, not just in this country. It's something we're talking about at RMI. How do you keep that optimism now? How do we keep that momentum if there is a change in this country in leadership and also other countries that have really significant carbon footprints that also have to address this issue?
Look, I get tremendous energy thinking about the debt we owe to future generations. I don't know a person, and there are folks, I mean, I was famously friends with Jim Inhofe, who was the biggest climate skeptic.
Snowball on the floor, remember that?
Snowball on the floor, Congress. But, at the end of the day, the reason we were friends, I'll tell you the secret, everybody always knows, was around his grandson, who was a huge New Orleans Saints fan. And so, being able to, I can't even remember what it was, something very small, but it was meaningful. Like, at the end of the day, we have to go back to basics. We all care about our kids and our grandchildren and their future. They are reminding us with a sense of urgency, if not anger, and sometimes almost indignation of their future and what they feel like we are leaving to them. And then it all comes down to local. At the end of the day, all politics truly is local. And so being here in Miami is a great reminder of that. When I'm in New Orleans, I feel the same way. If you looked at the politics, the closer you get to the people who are actually living it, the more they understand. And so we have to continue, this is a democracy, to use our voice and to remember that community is the agent of change. That's the level of change that is so fascinating to me. A community that decides to act on its own behalf can be incredibly strong. So we need to revitalize those connections as communities, remember why they're important, work together, and then keep working.
We have to end, unfortunately. We're over time. I would have so many more questions for you. I am not endorsing Apple with this next comment, but I wanted to just leave you all with this, something I found out in preparing for this. On your phone, on your desktop, if you have a Mac, go to the weather app. If you go to the weather app and you scroll up, right now, today, we're +5 degrees Fahrenheit above average temperature for Miami. And I think that's just a wonderful educational tool that wherever you are in the world, because of that technology, you can track it against historic temperatures going back many, many years. So check that out. I think it's super cool as a former science teacher and someone who continues to educate folks on these very important issues. Thank you so much, Lisa. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye, y'all.
This concludes our session on the stage. Please check the Aspen Ideas Climate app for the schedule and other updates. And don't forget to use the hashtag #AspenIdeasClimate to amplify the important conversations you've heard today.